Chapter 3. Grandmother sat in her armchair by the wood fire in the drawing-room. In the old days she had always got up to receive her visitors, but nowadays, with her rheumatism so much worse than it used to be, she could no longer rise gracefully from her chair, so she remained contentedly seated. She had always been beautiful, was beautiful now, and had every intention of remaining beautiful until the end of her days. And she did not in the least begrudge either the spending of a great deal of time and trouble upon the outer facade of beauty, or the curtailing of her activities by the illumination of those which she could no longer accomplish with grace. It seemed to her children and grandchildren that she did not mind growing old. There was nothing of desperation in the firm hold she kept upon her beauty. It was rather that she appeared to be taking good care of something entrusted to her, but did not seem to regard it as an integral part of her. "Nadine, my dear, I am so glad to see you," said Grandmother. Her voice had deepened with old age, but lost none of its eager warmth, and it had gained that lilt of music that comes into the voices of the old when they are without querulousness. "You're alone, dear?" "Yes, Grandmother," replied Nadine. "Did you expect me not to be?" "I just thought, dear, that perhaps George and the children might have come with you after all," said Grandmother, trying to keep the disappointment out of her voice. "The whole family would have been too much to inflict on you," said Nadine lightly, "and George can't leave the War Office. I told you that, you know, when you rang up. Darling, how are you?" And Nadine bent to kiss her mother-in-law with mingled love, resentment and exasperation. She did deeply love Lucilla, but she did not forget that in the past, when it had come to a battle of wills between them, Grandmother had won, and she could never quite accept with acquiescence, as did the rest of the family, the fact that this frail old woman, sitting here in this absurd old-fashioned room, and never even raising her voice, moulded the entire Elliot clan as wax in her fingers. Nadine was a woman of strong character, and the knowledge that since she had taken the name of Elliot, she had scarcely ever had her own way made her at times feel like a cat with its fur stroked backwards. Grandmother, Lucilla Elliot, had spent practically the whole of the greatest war in history either sitting in her armchair by the fire or on really hot days sitting in her wicker chair out in the garden under the ilex tree, the bastard lying at her feet with his chin propped on one of her shoes, Pooh-Bah sitting beside her. She had left the fire or the ilex tree only to go to church, bed, to meals in the dining room, or to pay a rare call upon an old friend. It was the opinion of her children and grandchildren that dear Grandmother had felt the war very little. Nothing that happened, not even the eruption of evacuees into her home, had ruffled her outward serenity, and she had made very little comment upon it. The change in her appearance that had taken place during the 6 years they put down merely to the passing of the years. Old people did not feel things very much, they said, and what a comfort that was. But as a matter of fact, the 6 years of the war had been for Lucilla a time of mental and spiritual activity and suffering as great as any she had known. And she had had to go through it all without her beloved old maid, Ellen, who had always been through everything with her before, and whom she had loved more than anyone had any idea of, except perhaps Hilary. Dame Rose Hay, that nearly 20 years ago had been bought by Lucilla as a sanctuary where the whole family could come to be remade when the turmoil of life in the world had chipped bits off them, had through long periods of the war been obliged to say goodbye to its peace. The English Channel was to the south of the marshes. The estuary, leading to one of the greatest of the naval ports, bounded them upon the east. Enemy planes had passed over day and night, guns had roared out at sea, and the old house had rocked to the explosions of bombs falling in the marshes. Lucilla was a brave woman, and physical danger had no terrors for her, but quiet was essential to her well-being, and she had suffered excruciating torture from the racket. Through long, noisy nights, she had laid rigid in her bed, her hands gripping the sheets upon either side of her, trying not to cry just because the noise made her feel so terribly exhausted. Her one desire upon these occasions had been to be let alone, but she had never been let alone. her daughter Margaret, and any visitors, evacuees or servants who might be with them at the time, had always come along in dressing gowns to sit with her lest she should be frightened. At least so they had said. It was, as it happened, they who had been frightened, and their subconscious reason for coming had been to stay themselves upon her courage. This they had done, exhausting her still further, but she had given no signs of exhaustion. She had kept them laughing through the night, telling them tales of her youth, and when the raid was over she had made them tea and sent them back to bed to sleep soundly until morning, while she lay awake, too tired to sleep. But the noise and the necessity for bolstering up the others had been as nothing to the torturing anxiety of those years. In the First War, Lucilla had lost 2 of her 5 sons, one of them her son Maurice, the great love of her life, and had suffered deep anxiety for the other 3. In this war, of the 3 sons left her, Hilary, George and Stephen, only George had been fighting, but the 2 sons of her son Stephen, the lawyer, went into the services, and also David, Maurice's only son, whom she had brought up from his babyhood, and who meant to her quite simply the whole of her world. Stephen's sons had been killed, one in Norway and one in Greece, and day by day she had waited for news of David's death in the air. The first war had taken his father, this one would take him. On the first day of the war she had made up her mind to that, arming herself beforehand to face what would be the worst thing that could possibly happen to her. The fact that it hadn't happened, that by some miracle David had come through safely, had not altered the fact that for 6 years she had expected it to happen, and through every day of those 6 years had never heard a ring at the bell or a step in the hall without steeling herself to face the shattering of her world. The perpetual anticlimaxes, when the ring at the bell had been only the butcher, and the step only Margaret back from her Red Cross working party earlier than usual, had been in themselves exhausting. And then for a woman of Lucilla's vivid imagination and deep sympathies, her own personal sorrows and anxieties had not been the only ones that she had to bear. She had borne also, as much as she was able, of the sorrow of the world. For she had learned really to pray. For the first time in her life she had discovered prayer to be not what it had hitherto been to her, the conscious occupation of the praying mind or the sound of the voice praying, but a ceaseless offering up of the whole personality, of every thought and word to action, and action as sacrifice. And it was exceedingly tiring. So that what with one thing and another, Lucilla had spent a very active 6 years. But sitting in her chair before the fire or under the ilex tree, knitting hour after hour for the forces or for the evacuee children who surged about her, she had been careful to give no sign, either by word or look, of the extent of her endurance. It had been her opinion that in wartime old people were a great nuisance, and the best thing they could do was to keep, at whatever cost, a tranquil exterior, and get on with their knitting. She was too humble a woman to assess her wartime activity at its true value. But it had left its mark, and Nadine, who had not seen grandmother for more than a year, was saddened at the change in her. She had to hold her tall, slender figure so rigidly to keep herself from sagging that she had lost some of her grace. Her blue eyes were sunken and her face deeply lined. But she was still most beautiful. The undefinable elements of her beauty, her elegance and dignity and luminous vitality, seeming to have deepened in quality now that the more obvious loveliness had faded. And her fastidious daintiness was as adorable as ever, and to Nadine deeply touching, because she guessed at what cost it was achieved. There was no Ellen now, and Margaret was the clumsiest creature who ever lived, so it must have been she herself who had dressed her lovely white hair so perfectly, and sewn such spotless lace at the neck and wrists of her simple black frock, with the faint scent of verbena clinging to its folds, and the task could have been neither quick nor easy for her rheumatic-y hands. "You're just the same, grandmother," lied Nadine, as she bent to kiss her, speaking with as much intent to comfort herself as to please grandmother. Lucilla smiled as she returned the kiss, and did not contradict the lie. Indeed, she answered it with another. "So are you, my dear." Then they looked at each other and laughed with complete sympathy and comprehension. Two beautiful women who had very low opinion of the stark realities of life and a very high opinion of covering them up with a little persiflage. Nadine straightened herself and looked about her. Thrones had fallen, armies had vanished into oblivion, great cities had been wiped off the face of the earth, but in the Dame Rosehay drawing-room not a single ornament had suffered a change of position. The Dresden shepherds and shepherdesses, lambs and cupids stood just as they had always stood upon the mantelpiece. Gay patches of colour against the great carved overmantel, the Sheraton chairs stood in the same positions upon the Persian rugs. The stiff 18th century chintz that covered the sofa and armchairs was the same, and bowls of flowers stood where they had always stood. The drawing-room was not what it had been several years ago. There were many more darns in the rugs, more cracks in the chintz, and the dents and scratches presented to the chair legs by the kicking feet of the grandchildren had been added to by those of the evacuees. Like Lucilla, it had suffered a slight tarnishing of the outward facade of its beauty, but the essence of it was unchanged.